Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets across the isolated homestead. The wind howled through the pines, carrying flakes that stung like tiny needles against exposed skin. But it wasn't the bitter cold that made Nathaniel Nate Sullivan's blood run cold. It was the torches. Dozens of them, flickering through the snowfall, held aloft by men whose faces were shadowed beneath hat brims and mufflers. They surrounded the property in a loose semicircle, their boots crunching on the fresh snow as they advanced toward the cabin. Nate stood on the porch, unarmed, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Behind him, three women, their features distinct from the settlers who populated this corner of Arizona territory, stood in silent defiance. Beside them, a small girl with wheat-colored hair clutched the skirt of the youngest woman. The mob's leader stepped forward, torch held high. "Bring those savages out, Sullivan. They don't belong here." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Some men brandished rifles, others held ropes. Their intentions couldn't have been clearer. Nate's voice when it came was steady, carrying across the yard. "This is my family. They're here because they chose to stay, not because I forced them." The leader spat into the snow. "That ain't natural, and you know it. We don't want their kind here, not after what happened to the Hendersons." Nate's hands clenched at his sides, but his face remained impassive. "You'll have to go through me first." A moment of tension stretched, tight as a bowstring. 6 months earlier. The sun beat down mercilessly on Twin Forks, baking the dirt streets and weathered buildings. Heat shimmered above the ground in wavering lines as Nate Sullivan hitched his horse outside the general store. He adjusted his hat against the glare, his shirt already damp with sweat despite the early hour. Twin Forks wasn't much of a town. A general store, saloon, livery, and a handful of other establishments strung along the main street. But it was the closest settlement to Nate's homestead, a necessary connection to supplies and medicine he couldn't produce himself. Today's journey had a particular urgency. His daughter Hannah had developed a persistent cough that worried him. At 7 years old, she was small for her age, quiet in a way children shouldn't be. The local remedy of honey and whiskey hadn't helped, and though Nate had medical knowledge from his days as an army surgeon, some ailments required specific treatments he didn't keep on hand. "Morning, Sullivan." The storekeeper nodded as Nate entered, the bell above the door announcing his arrival. "Didn't expect to see you for another week or two." "Hannah's sick," Nate replied simply, removing his hat. "Need some laudanum and willow bark." The storekeeper's face softened slightly. Everyone knew Sullivan's story. The widower raising a daughter alone after his wife died in childbirth. Some pitied him. Others thought he was a fool for trying to run a homestead without a wife. All agreed he kept to himself too much. "Got some laudanum in the back," the storekeeper said. "Willow bark too, I believe. Mrs. Jenkins still looking after your girl when you come to town?" Nate nodded, grateful for the elderly neighbor who watched Hannah during his infrequent trips to Twin Forks. The drought had made these journeys more necessary and more difficult. Water was scarce and crops were failing throughout the territory. As he waited for his purchases to be gathered, a commotion from behind the saloon caught his attention. Raised voices, jeering laughter. Normally, Nate would have ignored it. Twin Forks business wasn't his concern, but something in the tone made him pause. "What's happening back there?" he asked the storekeeper. The man barely glanced up. "Blackwood brought in some Apache women. Found them trespassing, he claims. Selling them off, I expect." A coldness settled in Nate's chest, having nothing to do with the store's relative shade. "Selling them?" "It's legal enough if they're prisoners," the storekeeper shrugged, counting out Nate's change. "Better than what usually happens to their kind." Nate pocketed the medicine, his mind racing. He hadn't practiced medicine since Elizabeth died, since he'd failed to save his own wife despite years of saving others on blood-soaked battlefields. But some instincts never faded. "I'll be back for these," he said, placing his hat back on his head. The storekeeper's response was lost as Nate stepped back into the punishing sun. The crowd behind the saloon was smaller than the noise suggested, perhaps a dozen men, mostly workers from nearby ranches and mines. They formed a loose circle around the focal point of their attention. Three women, Native American by their appearance, standing with their backs against the saloon's rear wall. Ezra Blackwood stood beside them, a man known throughout the territory as a bounty hunter and trader of questionable reputation. Tall and lean with a face weathered by sun and hard living, he addressed the crowd with the practiced charm of an auctioneer. "Found these three trespassing near Cottonwood Creek," he announced, gesturing to the women. "Sheriff says they're legally acquired property, but I ain't got use for 'em myself. $6 takes all three. Won't separate 'em." Nate assessed the women with a medical eye. The tallest appeared to be in her late 20s, standing straight-backed despite the circumstances. Her dark eyes held a fierce intelligence, surveying the crowd with undisguised contempt. The second woman was slightly younger, perhaps mid-20s, with a small tattoo visible on her wrist. She stared fixedly at the ground, her jaw clenched tight. The youngest couldn't have been more than 20, with a sadness in her eyes that seemed too deep for her years. None showed signs of serious physical mistreatment, but their posture spoke of exhaustion and resignation. They'd been through something terrible long before Blackwood found them. "What do?" someone called from the crowd. "They house-trained?" Laughter rippled through the onlookers. Blackwood smirked. "They're Apache women. They can cook, clean 10 gardens, do whatever you train them to do." More crude suggestions followed, met with louder laughter. Nate felt a familiar weight settle in his chest, the same feeling he'd had on battlefields when confronted with suffering he could neither prevent nor fully address. His thoughts turned to Hannah, waiting back at the homestead, to the quiet house that had never known a mother's touch, to Elizabeth, who died bringing their daughter into the world while he, a doctor, stood by helpless to save her. Some hurts couldn't be healed, but some actions couldn't be ignored. Before he'd fully formed the decision, Nate found himself stepping forward. The crowd parted slightly, surprised to see the reclusive Sullivan involving himself in town business. "I'll take them," he said, his voice carrying in the sudden quiet. Blackwood's eyebrows rose. "All three, Sullivan? That's mighty generous. Didn't know your tastes ran that way." More snickering from the crowd. Nate ignored it, reaching into his pocket for the money he'd intended to spend on additional supplies. $6, nearly half of what he'd brought to town. "I'm not buying people," he said, evenly holding out the bills. "I'm paying for their freedom. If they want somewhere to stay, I'm offering." Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes as he accepted the money. "Your money. Your choice. How to waste it." He gestured toward the women. "They're all yours." The tallest woman's eyes fixed on Nate's face, studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Not with fear, but with the sense she was seeing more than he intended to reveal. "Come with me if you want," Nate said to them quietly, "or go your own way. Your choice." For a moment, none of them moved. Then, without a word, the tallest woman stepped forward. The others followed, maintaining a careful distance from Nate and the still-watching crowd. As they walked toward his wagon, whispers followed. "Sullivan's gone mad. Letting savages near his daughter. After what happened to the Hendersons." Nate helped the women into the back of his wagon, acutely aware of their wary gazes. He climbed onto the seat and took up the reins, suddenly uncertain of what he'd just done. Elizabeth would have understood. Elizabeth would have done the same without hesitation. But Elizabeth wasn't here. She hadn't been for 7 long years. The journey back to Whispering Creek was conducted in complete silence. Nate didn't attempt conversation, and the women made no sound behind him. The only noises were the creak of wagon wheels and the rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves on the dusty trail. 2 hours from town, Nate stopped by a small creek, little more than a trickle in the drought, but still flowing enough to refill canteens. He climbed down from the wagon and turned to the women. "You can drink," he said, gesturing to the creek. "Rest a bit." The 3 women exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. The tallest nodded once, and they climbed carefully from the wagon. Nate noticed they stayed close together, the youngest always protected between the other 2. He moved away, giving them space, and settled beneath the shade of a cottonwood tree. The heat was oppressive, the air so dry it seemed to pull moisture from his skin with each breath. Nate closed his eyes briefly, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd done. What would he tell Hannah? How would he explain these strangers? And what if they decided to leave? How would he explain that? Opening his eyes, Nate gazed across the vast expanse of scrubland and distant mesas. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Elizabeth's spirit watched him. Would she approve? Or would she think him a fool for bringing potential danger to their daughter's door? The women had finished drinking and now stood in a tight cluster, waiting. The tallest met his gaze steadily, neither friendly nor hostile, simply assessing. Nate stood, brushing dust from his trousers. We should keep moving, still a ways to go. The remainder of the journey passed in the same silence. As they approached Whispering Creek, Nate felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the mixture of comfort and grief that always accompanied his return home. The homestead was modest, a main cabin built of logs with a stone chimney, a small barn, corral, and garden plot that was struggling in the drought. A creek, now barely flowing, curved around the property, giving the homestead its name. In spring, when water ran high, the sound it made through the rocks was like whispered conversations. As the wagon pulled up to the cabin, the front door flew open. Hannah stood in the doorway, her small face lighting up at the sight of her father. Behind her, the elderly figure of Mae Jenkins appeared, one hand resting protectively on Hannah's shoulder. "Papa," Hannah called, stepping onto the porch. Then she froze, noticing the three strangers in the wagon. Nate climbed down, forcing a reassuring smile. "Hannah, Mrs. Jenkins, I'm back." Mrs. Jenkins' eyes widened as she took in the women. Her mouth formed a thin line of disapproval. "Mr. Sullivan," she said stiffly, "I wasn't expecting company." "Neither was I," Nate replied honestly. He turned to the women still seated in the wagon. "This is my home. You're welcome to stay as long as you need." The women climbed down, maintaining their distance from both Nate and the porch. Hannah shrank back against Mrs. Jenkins, who placed both hands firmly on the child's shoulders. "Mr. Sullivan," Mrs. Jenkins said in a low voice, "a word, if you please." Nate nodded, then addressed the women again. "There's water in the barrel by the porch. Help yourselves." He followed Mrs. Jenkins inside, where she immediately rounded on him, keeping her voice low but intense. "Have you lost your mind, Nathaniel Sullivan? Bringing Apache women here? After what happened to the Henderson family?" Nate sighed, removing his hat. "They're human beings, Mrs. Jenkins. They were being sold like cattle." "There's a reason for that," "They can't be trusted. The things their people have done, I've seen worse done by men in uniform," Nate cut her off, his voice harder than intended. "During the war, by both sides." Mrs. Jenkins pressed her lips together, then glanced at Hannah, who stood by the window watching the women outside with wide eyes. "And what about your daughter?" Mrs. Jenkins asked more quietly. "Have you considered her safety?" The question stung because it echoed Nate's own doubts, but he held firm. "I have, and I've also considered what I'm teaching her about how to treat other human beings." The older woman shook her head. "I can't stay tonight, not with them here, and I won't be back until they are gone." She gathered her shawl and bag. "Your wife would be worried sick, God rest her soul." The mention of Elizabeth felt like a physical blow. Nate didn't respond as Mrs. Assaw. Jenkins kissed Hannah's forehead and left, giving the three women a wide berth as she headed for the path that led to her own homestead half a mile away. Hannah turned to her father, her eyes huge in her small face. "Who are they, Papa?" Nate crouched beside his daughter, smoothing a strand of blonde hair from her forehead. "So like her mother's. They needed help, sweetheart, so we're helping them." "Are they going to stay with us?" "For a little while, I think, until they decide where they want to go." Hannah considered this with a child's solemnity. "What are their names?" Nate realized he didn't know, hadn't even asked. "I'm not sure yet. Maybe we can find out together." Outside, the three women had moved to the shade of the porch overhang, still standing close together, still watching. Night fell, bringing blessed relief from the heat. Nate had shown the women to the converted storage shed attached to the barn, a simple space with a dirt floor, but it had a small window and a door that latched from the inside. He'd provided blankets, water, and a portion of the stew he'd made for dinner. They'd accepted the offering silently, the tallest woman nodding once in acknowledgement. None had spoken a word since their arrival. Hannah was asleep now, her cough slightly improved with the medicine Nate had administered. He sat alone on the porch, watching the stars appear in the vast desert sky. A sliver of moon provided just enough light to see by without a lantern. The creak of a floorboard alerted him to another presence. Nate turned, surprised to find the tallest of the three women standing at the corner of the porch. He hadn't heard her approach, an impressive feat given the age of the wooden planks beneath her feet. For a long moment, they regarded each other in silence. Then to Nate's astonishment, she spoke in perfect, unaccented English. "Why aren't you afraid we'll kill you in your sleep?" The question was delivered matter-of-factly, without threat or emotion. Nate took a moment to gather his thoughts, equally surprised by her fluency and the directness of her question. "I suppose," he finally answered, "because I saw something in your eyes that wasn't hatred, only suffering. And suffering is something I understand well." She studied him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "My name is Ayanna." "Nathaniel Sullivan," he replied, "though most call me Nate." "I know, your neighbor said it." She moved closer, though still maintaining a careful distance. "The others are Dolly and Enola. We are not of the same band, but we have traveled together for many months." Nate nodded, processing this information. "You speak English very well." "I was educated at a mission school," Ayanna said, her tone revealing nothing of how she felt about this experience. "They thought they could save our souls by erasing our language." The bitterness in her final words was subtle but unmistakable. Nate didn't press for more details. "Your daughter," Ayanna continued, "she is sick?" "A chest cold," Nate replied. "Nothing serious, but it worries me. She's always been delicate." "And her mother?" "Died in childbirth," Nate said, the familiar ache returning. 7 years ago." Ayanna nodded once, as if confirming something she'd already suspected. "You were a healer. I can tell by your hands and how you look at injuries." Nate glanced down at his hands, a surgeon's hands, once capable of extracting bullets and stitching wounds under the most desperate circumstances. Now they mostly dug in the earth and repaired farm equipment. "I was an army surgeon," he confirmed, "during the war. And now? Now I'm just a farmer trying to raise his daughter." Ayanna considered this, then asked the question that seemed to truly interest her. "Why did you buy us?" The directness caught Nate off guard again, though it shouldn't have. "I didn't buy you, I paid Blackwood to let you go." "A distinction without much difference to us," she replied coolly. "Why bang?" Nate looked out at the darkness, gathering his thoughts. "Because no one should be bought and sold. Because my wife would have done the same. Because," he paused, then decided on honesty, "because sometimes I need to know I can still help someone, even when I couldn't help her." Ayanna remained silent for so long that Nate wondered if she'd leave without responding. Finally, she spoke. "We will stay until Enola is stronger. Then we will decide." Before Nate could reply, she had melted back into the darkness, leaving him alone with the night sounds of the desert and his own troubled thoughts. Dawn arrived with the harsh clarity particular to desert mornings. Nate rose before first light, as was his habit, moving quietly so as not to wake Hannah. There were animals to tend, water to haul, tasks that couldn't wait regardless of who sheltered under his roof. He was surprised to find Ayanna already at the well, drawing up water with practiced efficiency. She acknowledged him with a nod, but didn't speak. "You don't need to work," Nate said, approaching cautiously. "You're guests here, not servants." "We are not guests," Ayanna replied without pausing in her task. "Guests are invited. We were purchased." "I told you, yes, you paid for our freedom." She lifted the full bucket from the well. "But freedom means making our own choices. We choose to work while we stay. We are not beggars or children to be cared for." Nate recognized the pride in her posture, the determination to maintain dignity despite circumstances. It was a feeling he understood all too well. "Fair enough," he conceded, "but you should know what needs doing. The garden needs weeding and watering. The roof leaks in the corner by the chimney, and there's mending that I've put off too long." Ayanna nodded once. "Dolly is good with animals. Enola with children and growing things. I can fix what is broken." By mid-morning, a strange new rhythm had established itself at Whispering Creek. Dolly, the woman with the wrist tattoo, had indeed shown a remarkable affinity for animals. She'd discovered Nate's horse had a stone bruise on its hoof, something he'd missed, and was treating it with a poultice of her own making. Enola, the youngest, had coaxed Hannah into the garden, where they were carefully watering the struggling plants. The girl's initial fear had given way to curiosity, especially when Enola began drawing patterns in the dirt that made Hannah giggle. Ayanna had found Nate's tools and was examining the roof, her movements confident and purposeful. Watching her, Nate was struck by how quickly they'd adapted, not submitting to servitude but asserting themselves through useful action. Hannah's cough interrupted his observations. The sound was harsh, rattling in her small chest. Nate immediately went to her, feeling her forehead with the back of his hand. No fever, thankfully, but the cough was worse than yesterday. Enola looked up with concern in her dark eyes. Without speaking, she rose and disappeared around the side of the house. When she returned minutes later, she carried a handful of plants Nate didn't recognize. She approached cautiously, holding out her collection for his inspection. When he looked confused, she pointed to Hannah, then mimed drinking something. "Medicine?" Nate asked. Enola nodded, her eyes serious. Nate hesitated. His medical training made him wary of unknown treatments, but he also recognized that indigenous knowledge of local plants often exceeded what was taught in medical schools. "Show me how," he said finally. Enola's preparation was methodical. She selected specific parts of the plants, crushed some, stripped others, and boiled the mixture in a small pot over the fire. The resulting liquid was greenish and smelled strongly of sage, and something else Nate couldn't identify. When it had cooled, she offered it to Hannah in a cup. The girl looked to her father for permission. "It's medicine," Nate explained, "for your cough." Hannah grimaced at the smell but obediently took a sip. Her face screwed up comically at the taste, drawing a rare smile from Enola. By evening, Hannah's cough had noticeably improved. The child was breathing easier, her usual energy returning enough that she wanted to help prepare dinner. Nate found himself watching Enola with newfound respect. She noticed his gaze and quickly looked away, but not before he saw something vulnerable in her expression. That night, after Hannah was asleep, Nate again sat on the porch, contemplating the day's developments. The rhythmic sound of Ayana's hammering came from the shed where the women were staying. Apparently, she was making improvements to their temporary home. Footsteps approached, lighter than Ayana's. Nate turned to see Dolly standing at the edge of the porch light. Unlike Ayana's confident stance, Dolly's posture was guarded, her eyes watchful. "Your horse will heal," she said in English that was accented but clear. "But she needs rest, no riding for 3 days." Nate nodded his thanks. "I appreciate your help. You have a way with animals." Dolly's expression remained neutral. "Animals are honest. They do not lie about their intentions." The implication was clear. Nate met her gaze steadily. "I meant what I said yesterday. You're free to leave whenever you choose." "Free," Dolly repeated, as if testing the word. "There is no such thing for people like us in your world. Only different kinds of cages." Before Nate could respond, she had turned and walked away, her form dissolving into the darkness beyond the porch light. Days passed, settling into an unexpected routine. The three women worked alongside Nate, not as servants, but as people determined to earn their place. Hannah's cough vanished completely, thanks to Enola's remedy, and the child had begun following the quiet woman around like a shadow, fascinated by her knowledge of plants and the stories she told through drawings in the dirt. Ayana proved to be remarkably skilled with tools and construction. She'd repaired not only the roof, but also several pieces of furniture that had been broken for months. Dolly kept largely to herself, tending the animals and disappearing for hours to hunt with a bow she'd crafted from materials around the homestead. Nate found himself gradually relaxing in their presence. Their silence no longer seemed hostile, but contemplative. They spoke when necessary, mostly in their own language among themselves, occasionally in English to him or Hannah. One evening, as the heat of the day finally began to subside, Nate broached a subject that had been on his mind. "The shed is too small for 3 people," he said, as they ate dinner outdoors to catch the cooler air. "I've been thinking we should build a second cabin." The women exchanged glances, their usual form of silent communication. "Why?" Ayana finally asked. "For privacy, for comfort." Nate gestured around the property. "There's plenty of space, plenty of materials." "We are not your wives," Ayana said bluntly, "nor your workers." "I know that," Nate replied, meeting her gaze. "This isn't about ownership. It's about giving all of us room to breathe." Ayana studied him for a long moment, then turned to the others. They conferred briefly in their own language before she turned back to him. "We will help build," she decided. "Not because we owe you, but because we choose to." The next morning, they began clearing ground for the new cabin. Hannah watched with excitement, asking endless questions about how buildings were made. Nate found himself smiling more than he had in years, not because everything was perfect, but because there was purpose in the work, a shared goal that transcended their differences. As the sun reached its zenith, forcing them to pause their labor, Nate noticed Ayanna watching him with that same intense scrutiny she'd shown from the beginning. "Why did you buy all three of us?" she asked when they were alone, gathering more tools from the shed. Most men would have chosen one. Nate wiped sweat from his brow, considering his answer. "Because no one should have to choose who gets to be free," he finally said. "I saw enough of those choices during the war. They destroy something in you." Ayanna's expression softened slightly. "You were an army surgeon. You saved lives. Not all of them." The familiar weight of failure pressed on him. "Not the ones that mattered most. Your wife." It wasn't a question, but Nate nodded anyway. "Elizabeth. She hemorrhaged after Hannah was born. I couldn't stop the bleeding." His voice grew rough. "I'd saved men with half their insides blown out on battlefields, but I couldn't save my own wife in our own bed." The confession hung between them, more revealing than Nate had intended. He'd never spoken of it so plainly, not even to Mrs. Jenkins or the few other neighbors he occasionally interacted with. Ayanna was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its usual hardness. "My husband was a healer among our people," she said. "He died of the white man's fever 3 winters ago. Many died. He could not save them. And in trying, he could not save himself." She met Nate's eyes. "I do not blame him for failing. Some enemies cannot be fought with medicine alone." The simple statement, delivered without sentiment or pity, touched something deep in Nate. Not healing, he doubted that would ever come, but recognition, understanding. "Thank you," he said quietly. Ayanna nodded once, then returned to selecting tools as if the conversation had never happened. But something had shifted between them, a tiny fracture in the wall of reserve she maintained. As they worked side by side that afternoon, laying out the foundation for the new cabin, Nate found himself studying her profile, the strength in her jawline, the determination in her eyes. He quickly looked away when she turned toward him, not wanting her to misinterpret his attention. But later, catching her watching him with similar curiosity, he wondered if perhaps they were both seeing something unexpected in each other. That evening, Hannah sat on the porch with Enola, who was teaching her to braid small strips of leather. The girl had been unusually talkative all day, her natural childish curiosity gradually overcoming the reserve she'd inherited from her father. "Did you have a little girl like me?" Hannah asked suddenly, looking up at Enola. The young woman's hand stilled. Pain flashed across her face so quickly that Nate, watching from nearby, almost missed it. Enola shook her head slowly. "A boy," she said softly, one of the few times Nate had heard her speak English. "Little boy." Hannah's eyes widened. "Where is he now?" Enola looked toward the distant mountains, her expression so bereft that Nate nearly intervened. But before he could, she raised one hand toward the darkening sky. "With stars," she said. Hannah considered this with a child's understanding of death. Incomplete, but reverent. "My mama's with the stars, too," she said solemnly. Enola nodded, reaching out hesitantly to touch Hannah's hair. The gesture was so gentle, so maternal, that Nate felt a lump form in his throat. He turned away, giving them privacy in their shared loss. Later, after Hannah was asleep, Nate sat at his small table mending a torn shirt by lamplight. A soft knock at the door surprised him. Opening it, he found Ayanna standing in the darkness. "Enola is upset," she said without preamble. The child's questions brought back memories. "I heard," Nate replied. "I'm sorry. Hannah doesn't always understand. Children ask what they need to know." Ayanna cut him off. "But you should know about Enola. Her son was 1 year old when soldiers attacked our village. He died in the fighting. Enola nearly died from grief afterward." The information hit Nate like a physical blow. "I didn't know. Now you do." Ayanna's expression was unreadable in the lamplight. "She sees her son in your daughter. It brings both pain and healing." Nate nodded, understanding the warning and the explanation wrapped together. "I'll be mindful." "Good." Ayanna turned to go, then paused. "Your daughter. She is lucky to have a father who sees her." Before Nate could respond, she had disappeared into the darkness, leaving him to ponder her words and the glimpses he'd been given into these women's lives. Lives marked by loss and suffering, yet somehow containing resilience he could only admire. Returning to his mending, Nate realized something had changed within the homestead. The silence that had dominated Whispering Creek since Elizabeth's death was gradually being replaced by something else. Not noise exactly, but presence. The sense of other lives intersecting with his and Hannah's, bringing with them histories, pain, and perhaps possibilities he hadn't allowed himself to consider for years. It was terrifying. It was necessary. It was just possibly the beginning of healing. Ezra Blackwood returned on a scorching afternoon 3 weeks after Nate had paid for the women's freedom. He brought 2 armed men with him, riding up to the homestead with the casual confidence of someone who expected to get his way. Nate was working on the new cabin frame, which had taken shape rapidly thanks to Ayana's skilled direction. Hannah and Enola were tending the garden, which had begun to flourish under their combined care. Dolly was nowhere to be seen, likely hunting in the hills as had become her habit. Ayana spotted the riders first, her body tensing as she laid down her hammer. "Blackwood," she said, the name itself a warning. Nate straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Take Hannah inside," he told Enola, who immediately guided the child toward the main cabin without question. "Sullivan," Blackwood called as he dismounted. "Looks like you've been busy with your purchases." "They're not purchases," Nate replied evenly. "They're guests. What do you want, Blackwood?" The bounty hunter's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just checking on my merchandise. Seems there was a misunderstanding about our arrangement." "There was no arrangement. I paid you. They're free." Blackwood shook his head with exaggerated patience. "You paid for temporary use, not ownership. These Apache women are still legally my property, and I've come to collect." One of Blackwood's companions shifted in his saddle, his hand resting near his holstered pistol. The threat was implicit, but clear. Nate stood his ground, conscious of Ayana beside him, her posture rigid with barely contained fury. They're human beings, not property. They stay or go as they choose. "That's not how it works, Sullivan. They're savages, prisoners. The law says we are not your property." Ayana's voice cut through Blackwood's justifications like a blade. She stepped forward, addressing him in perfect English. "You do not own us. No one owns us. We are here because we choose to stay." Blackwood's expression flashed with surprise before hardening into anger. "You speak when spoken to, woman." "I speak when I have something to say," Ayana replied, her voice steady despite the danger. "You have no claim on us. The money was paid, the transaction completed. You accepted it before witnesses." Nate noticed movement from the corner of his eye. Dolly, returning from hunting, her bow in hand, assessing the situation from the edge of the trees. She knocked an arrow silently, waiting. Blackwood's hand twitched toward his gun. "This isn't over, Sullivan. These women are worth more than $6, and I aim to collect." "Leave my property," Nate said quietly. "Now." For a tense moment, it seemed Blackwood might escalate the confrontation. Then he spat on the ground, his gaze moving between Nate and Ayana with equal contempt. "We'll be back," he said. "And next time, I won't be so polite." The 3 men remounted and rode away, dust rising behind their horses in the still afternoon air. Only when they were out of sight did Nate release the breath he'd been holding. Dolly emerged from the trees, lowering her bow. "He will return," she said simply. "Yes," Ayana agreed, "with more men." Nate looked toward the main cabin, where Hannah's small face peered anxiously from the window, with Enola standing protectively behind her. "Then we'd better be prepared," he said. The threat of Blackwood's return hung over Whispering Creek like a thundercloud. Though days passed without incident, Nate found himself watching the horizon more carefully, listening for approaching hoofbeats with new vigilance. Each morning he checked his old army revolver, a weapon he had hoped never to use again. Yet despite the shadow of danger, life at the homestead continued to evolve in unexpected ways. The new cabin's frame rose steadily, each log and beam representing not just shelter, but something more profound, a commitment to staying, at least for now. Hannah flourished in the presence of the 3 women, especially Enola. The child's nightmares, which had plagued her since infancy, came less frequently. She spoke more, laughed more, asked endless questions about plants and animals and the Apache way of life. Watching her help Enola in the garden one afternoon, Nate realized he was seeing a side of his daughter that had been dormant since Elizabeth's death, perhaps even before. She's different, Nate observed to Ayana as they worked side by side on the cabin roof, securing wooden shingles against the occasional fierce desert winds. Ayana followed his gaze to where Hannah was carefully watering seedlings under Enola's patient guidance. Children need more than one voice in their lives, she said, more than one set of hands to guide them. The insight struck Nate with surprising force. He'd been so focused on not failing Hannah as a father that he'd overlooked how limiting a single parent's perspective might be. Elizabeth would have known this, he thought. Elizabeth would have sought out other influences for their daughter's growth. Thank you, he said simply, all of you, for what you've given her. Ayana nodded once, accepting his gratitude without comment. But later, when Hannah proudly showed them the first sprouts from seeds she and Enola had planted, Nate caught Ayana watching the child with a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. That evening, as twilight painted the desert in shades of purple and gold, Dolly returned from hunting with 2 rabbits. She'd proven herself remarkably skilled with her handcrafted bow, often bringing back game that supplemented their meals. Like Ayana, she had begun to unbend slightly in Nate's presence, though she remained the most reserved of the 3 women. As she prepared the rabbits for cooking, Nate noticed the small tattoo on her wrist more clearly than before, a simple design of interlocking triangles. Catching his glance, Dolly paused in her work. It marks me as married, she said without preamble. My husband was a warrior. He died in battle 3 winters ago. The statement, delivered in her accented but clear English, surprised Nate. Dolly rarely volunteered information about herself. I'm sorry, he offered. He died as he wished to die, protecting our people. Her hands resumed their skilled movements, separating meat from bone with practiced efficiency. I carry his mark so his spirit knows where to find me when we meet again, in the next world. Nate thought of Elizabeth, of the wedding ring he still wore, though it had been 7 years since her death. Different customs, same meaning, markers of those we've loved and lost. My wife's name was Elizabeth, he said. She loved to sing. Even when life was hard, and it often was, out here, she found reasons to sing. Dolly's hands stilled again, her dark eyes lifting to his face. For once, the wariness in them had dimmed. My husband, Kia, he loved to tell stories. Every night, stories of our ancestors, of great hunts, of the stars. A shadow of pain crossed her features. Sometimes I cannot remember the sound of his voice. The confession struck a chord in Nate. How many times had he strained to recall the exact timbre of Elizabeth's laugh, the precise shade of blue in her eyes? How those memories faded despite his desperate attempts to hold them. I know, he said quietly. They finished preparing the meal in companionable silence, a new understanding bridging the gap between them. That night, for the first time since her arrival, Dolly joined them all for dinner inside the main cabin rather than taking her portion to eat alone. As they ate, Hannah asked innocently, "Why does Sheriff Cooper not like you, Papa?" Nate nearly choked on his stew. "What makes you think that?" "Mrs. Jenkins told me. She said the sheriff thinks you're a troublemaker for having—" Hannah frowned, trying to recall the exact words. "For having divided loyalties." Ayana and Dolly exchanged glances. Enola focused intently on her food. Nate set down his spoon, choosing his words carefully. "Sheriff Cooper and I have different ideas about certain things, Hannah. About people and how they should be treated. That doesn't mean he dislikes me. It just means we disagree." Hannah considered this. "Because of Ayana and Dolly and Enola?" "Partly, yes. But they're our friends now," Hannah said with a child's simple logic. "Why wouldn't he like them?" The question hung in the air, its innocence masking the complexity beneath. How to explain prejudice and fear to a 7-year-old? How to describe the tangled history of violence and retribution that had shaped relationships between settlers and indigenous people throughout the territory? To Nate's surprise, it was Enola who answered, her soft voice drawing everyone's attention. "Some people fear what they do not understand," she said, her English halting but clear. "Fear makes them see enemies where there are none." Hannah nodded, accepting this explanation more readily than any Nate might have offered. "That's silly," she declared. "You're not scary." A smile touched Enola's lips, brief but genuine. "No," she agreed, "not scary." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Nate found himself reflecting on Hannah's question long after the meal had ended. Sheriff Cooper had indeed been cool toward him on his infrequent visits to Twin Forks, and rumors had undoubtedly spread about the Apache women living at Whispering Creek. How long before that coolness hardened into something more dangerous? Later that night, unable to sleep, Nate stepped outside to check on the horses. The desert night was clear and cold, stars scattered across the sky like spilled salt. He was startled to find Ayana sitting on the porch steps, wrapped in a blanket against the chill, gazing upward at the same vista. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, settling beside her at a respectful distance. "I was listening," she replied. "To what?" "The night. It speaks differently here than in the mountains where I was born." She gestured toward the vast darkness surrounding the homestead. "Different animals, different winds, but the stars are the same." Nate followed her gaze upward. "Elizabeth knew the constellations. She'd point them out to me, but I could never remember their names. My people have our own names for them and stories for each group of stars." Ayana pointed to a bright cluster. "Those we call the Seven Sisters. They represent young women who fled to the sky to escape a hunter who pursued them." "Did they find safety there?" "Yes, but eternal separation from their people was the price." Her voice held a note of something Nate hadn't heard before, not quite sadness, but a deep weariness. "Sometimes safety comes at great cost." The observation lingered between them. Nate sensed she was speaking not just of ancient legends, but of her own experiences. "Why were you at Blackwood's mercy?" he asked carefully. "How did three women from different bands come to be sold together in Twin Forks?" Ayana was silent so long that Nate thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, measured. "We were part of a larger group traveling to the reservation at San Carlos. Women and children mostly. Our men had already been killed or captured. Soldiers were escorting us." Her eyes remained fixed on the stars. Near the border, a group of men, traders they said, approached the soldiers with whiskey and other goods. There was a bargain struck. 6 of us were handed over to these men in exchange for the whiskey. "My God," Nate murmured. "God was not present that day," Ayana said flatly. "The men took us north instead of to San Carlos. They—" She paused and Nate could see her gathering her strength. "They used the other women however they wished. Enola, Dolly, and I were kept apart, to be sold rather than used. We were worth more untouched," they said. Horror and rage filled Nate, not unfamiliar emotions from his days on Civil War battlefields, but somehow sharper now, more personal. "And the other women?" "Dead, or worse." Ayana's profile was stark against the starlit sky. "We survived because we had skills the men thought valuable. Enola can heal with plants. Dolly can track and hunt. I speak English and can interpret. These things made us merchandise rather than merely entertainment." The clinical detachment with which she related such brutality made it somehow more devastating. Nate thought of his medical training, how he'd learned to distance himself from suffering in order to treat it effectively. Ayana had learned similar lessons, it seemed, though through far more terrible circumstances. "I'm sorry," he said, knowing how inadequate the words were. "Your sorrow changes nothing," Ayana replied, but without rancor. "Only actions matter in this world. Is that why you help build the cabin? Why Enola tends the garden and Dolly hunts? Actions rather than words." A faint smile touched her lips, visible in the starlight. "You understand more than I expected, Nathaniel Sullivan." They sat in silence for several minutes, the vastness of the desert night surrounding them. Finally, Nate spoke again. "Blackwood will return, won't he?" "Yes." Ayana's response was immediate, certain. "Men like him do not surrender what they consider theirs." "Then we should be ready." "We?" Her gaze turned to him, searching. "You would fight for us?" "I would fight to protect what's mine," Nate said. Then realizing how that sounded, he clarified. "Not that you're mine to own. But this home, it belongs to all of us now. Anyone who threatens that peace—" He trailed off, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. When had Whispering Creek ceased to be simply his homestead and become something more communal? Ayana studied him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "You were a healer, not a warrior." "I was both," Nate corrected her. "In war, the line blurs. I carried a gun even as I carried my medical bag." She nodded slowly as if confirming something to herself. "Good, because when Blackwood returns, he will not come to talk." The prediction hung in the night air like a promise, or a curse. Sheriff Cooper arrived at Whispering Creek 3 days later, riding alone under the merciless midday sun. Nate was repairing a section of fence when he spotted the lawman's approach, the badge on his chest catching the sunlight like a warning. Cooper was a big man, his face weathered by years of outdoor life and authority. He'd been sheriff of Twin Forks and the surrounding area for nearly a decade, maintaining a rough kind of order through a combination of intimidation and selective enforcement. Not corrupt exactly, but certainly flexible in how he applied the law. Nate set down his tools and walked to meet the sheriff at the edge of the property. From the corner of his eye, he saw Ayanna pause in her work on the new cabin, watching carefully. Dolly had disappeared into the barn to retrieve her bow, Nate suspected. Enola and Hannah were thankfully out of sight, gathering herbs in the shallow canyon behind the homestead. "Sheriff," Nate nodded as Cooper reined in his horse. "What brings you out this way?" Cooper surveyed the property before answering, his gaze lingering on Ayanna's distant figure. "Heard you've got yourself some interesting house guests, Sullivan." "News travels fast," Nate replied neutrally. "In these parts, it does." Although Cooper dismounted with a grunt, tethering his horse to the fence post, especially when it involves Apache women living free and easy on a white man's homestead. The implied criticism was clear, but Nate kept his expression even. "They're not prisoners, if that's your concern." "That's exactly my concern." Cooper removed his hat, wiping sweat from his brow. "Got reports they were legally acquired property that you're harboring. I paid for their freedom, not their servitude." Cooper's eyebrows rose. "That's so, because Blackwood tells a different story. Says you bought usage rights, not outright ownership. Says you're in violation of a legal contract." Nate felt a surge of anger but kept it from his voice. "There was no contract, Sheriff. I paid money. He handed over 3 human beings who were being treated like cattle. That transaction is complete as far as I'm concerned." "Not how the law sees it, Sullivan." Cooper replaced his hat, adjusting it against the sun. "Apache are wards of the government, supposed to be on reservations. Any found off-reservation can be treated as hostile. These women aren't hostile, they're just trying to survive." "Maybe so." Cooper's gaze drifted toward the new cabin frame. "But they're causing talk in town. Bad talk. After what happened to the Hendersons, folks are nervous about any Apache living free among settlers." The mention of the Hendersons, a family massacred in a raid the previous spring, was calculated to provoke. Nate refused to take the bait. These women had nothing to do with that attack. They were already captives by then. "Doesn't matter to most folks." Cooper turned back to Nate, his expression hardening. "I'm here to deliver a message, Sullivan. Either control your Apache women, keep them out of sight, make them behave like proper servants, or escort them to the reservation at San Carlos where they belong." Nate straightened, meeting the sheriff's gaze directly. "And if I do neither? Then I can't guarantee their safety. Or yours." Cooper's hand rested meaningfully on his holstered pistol. "Blackwood has friends in high places. Territorial judge owes him favors. Could be he gets a writ to reclaim his property, and I'd be bound to help enforce it." "They're not property," Nate said, his voice low but intense. "They're human beings with names and histories and rights." Cooper shook his head, a flicker of what might have been genuine regret crossing his features. "Save the sermon, Sullivan. I don't make the rules, I just enforce them." He untethered his horse and mounted with practiced ease. "You've got 1 week to decide what you're doing with them. After that, I can't promise what happens." He touched the brim of his hat in a mocking salute and turned his horse, riding away at an unhurried pace. Nate watched him go, tension knotting between his shoulder blades. Ayanna approached silently, coming to stand beside him as the sheriff disappeared over the ridge. What did he want? "To deliver a threat," Nate replied grimly, thinly disguised as law enforcement. He relayed Cooper's message, watching Ayanna's expression grow more closed with each word. When he finished, she was silent for several moments, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the sheriff had vanished. "What will you do?" she finally asked. The question caught Nate by surprise. "What will we do, you mean?" "No," Ayanna shook her head. "This is your decision. Your home, your daughter. We have survived before. We can survive again, elsewhere." The implication struck Nate like a physical blow, that they would leave, disappear back into the harsh landscape rather than bring trouble to his door. It was logical, practical even, and yet, no, he said, with more force than intended. This isn't just my home anymore. You've helped build it, tend it, protect it. You belong here as much as I do now. Something flickered in Ayana's eyes, surprise perhaps, or a deeper emotion she quickly masked. The sheriff is right about one thing, she said carefully. After what we've endured, the reservation would at least offer some protection. Many of our people are there. Is that what you want, to go to San Carlos? Ayana looked toward the new cabin, its frame now complete and awaiting the roof. What I want, she said slowly, has rarely mattered in this world. But no, I do not wish to live behind reservation fences, dependent on government rations and missionaries' charity. Then we stand our ground, Nate decided, together. Ayana studied him as if trying to gauge his resolve. You would risk everything, your home, your safety, your daughter's future, for 3 Apache women you have known barely a month? I'm not risking it for you, Nate clarified. I'm risking it with you. There's a difference. Yeah, a slight smile touched her lips, gone almost before it appeared. Yes, she agreed, there is. The next several days passed in a flurry of activity. The threat from both Blackwood and the sheriff lent new urgency to their work. The new cabin's roof was completed and the interior walls framed. Enola's garden was expanded, with more drought-resistant plants harvested from the surrounding desert. Dolly fashioned additional arrows and taught Nate to improve his aim with his old revolver. Throughout it all, Hannah watched with increasing curiosity. Though they tried to shield her from the full implications of the danger, children absorb more than adults often realize. One evening, as Nate tucked her into bed, she asked the question he'd been dreading. Are the bad men going to make Ayana and Dolly and Enola go away, Papa? Nate smoothed her hair back from her forehead, buying time to formulate an answer that wouldn't frighten her unnecessarily. Some people think they should live somewhere else, he said carefully. But we don't agree. I don't want them to leave, Hannah said, her lower lip trembling slightly. They're our family now. The simple declaration touched Nate deeply. Yes, he agreed, they are. And I promise I'll do everything I can to make sure they stay with us. Hannah seemed satisfied with this, her eyelids growing heavy with sleep. Nate kissed her forehead and rose quietly, turning down the lamp before slipping from the room. He found Enola sitting at the table, a collection of herbs spread before her as she sorted and bundled them for drying. She looked up as he entered, her eyes questioning. She's worried you'll all be taken away, Nate explained softly. Enola's hand stilled among the herbs. She has lost too much already, she said, her English careful but clear. A child should not fear more loss. No, she shouldn't. Nate sat across from her, watching her slender fingers resume their work. Enola, if things become dangerous here, I want you to take Hannah and go to Mrs. Jenkins. She may not approve of our arrangement, but she wouldn't let harm come to a child. Enola looked up sharply. You expect fighting? I expect Blackwood to try to take by force what he couldn't take by intimidation. Nate kept his voice low, conscious of Hannah sleeping nearby. And I don't want my daughter caught in the middle. Or me, Enola said perceptively. Nate couldn't deny it. Of the 3 women, Enola was the most vulnerable, the youngest, the least hardened by experience despite her losses. I don't want any of you hurt, but Hannah trusts you most. She would go with you without question. Enola was quiet for a moment, her dark eyes thoughtful. When my son was born, she said finally, his father was already dead, killed by soldiers. I promised my son I would protect him always. Her voice caught slightly. I failed him. I will not fail your daughter. The raw honesty of her words struck Nate to the core. Thank you, he said simply. Enola nodded once, then returned to her herbs, the conversation clearly finished. Nate rose and stepped outside, needing air and space to think. The night was cool, stars brilliant overhead. Nate walked toward the new cabin, now nearly complete. Its silhouette against the starlit sky represented something he hadn't fully acknowledged until Hannah's innocent declaration. Family. Not traditional, not expected, but family nonetheless. A figure emerged from the shadows near the barn, Dolly, returning from one of her solitary evening walks. She approached, her movement nearly silent on the packed earth. You are troubled, she observed. Cooper gave us a week, Nate replied. 4 days have passed. Dolly nodded, her expression grave in the dim light. Blackwood will not wait for the sheriff's permission. He will come before then. How can you be sure? Because men like him do not share power, even with law. Dolly's hand went to the knife at her belt, a habit Nate had noticed when she was anxious or considering a problem. He lost face when we defied him. He will want to restore his honor. Nate considered this. You think he'll attack at night? Try to take you by stealth? No, Dolly shook her head. He is too proud for that. He will come in daylight, with men to witness his victory, to show others that he cannot be defied. The assessment matched Nate's own instincts. Blackwood was a showman as much as a hunter, a man who valued his reputation. Then we should be ready, he said. We already are. Dolly touched her tattoo briefly, a gesture Nate had come to recognize as her way of drawing strength from her late husband's memory. We have survived worse than Ezra Blackwood. As she turned to go, Nate called after her softly. Dolly, thank you for everything you have done here. She paused, looking back at him with an unreadable expression. This place, she said after a moment, it reminds me of home. Before the soldiers came. A good place. Worth protecting. The simple statement contained volumes. Coming from the reserved Dolly, it was practically a declaration of allegiance. She disappeared into the darkness before Nate could respond, leaving him to ponder her words. Worth protecting. Yes, he thought, looking around at the homestead that had changed so dramatically in just a few weeks. Whispering Creek had always been his refuge, his attempt to build something lasting after the chaos of war and the devastation of Elizabeth's death. But it had also been incomplete, haunted by absence. Now, despite the looming threat, or perhaps because of it, the homestead felt whole in a way it never had before. There was purpose here, connection, the beginnings of healing for wounds he'd thought would never close. Whatever came next, Nate realized, he would fight for this fragile new reality with everything he had. The nightmare jolted Nate awake in the dead of night, heart pounding, sweat dampening his shirt despite the cool air. In the dream, he'd been back in a field hospital during the war, trying desperately to save a wounded soldier whose face kept shifting between Elizabeth's and Hannah's. Blood had seeped between his fingers as he worked, no matter how tightly he pressed on the wound. He sat up, running a shaky hand through his hair. These dreams came less frequently now than in the years immediately following Elizabeth's death, but they still arrived without warning, leaving him shaken and disoriented. Quiet movement caught his attention, a shadow near the door. Dolly stood there, a steaming cup in her hands. You called out, she explained, her voice low so as not to wake Hannah. I heard from outside. Nate hadn't realized he'd made any sound during the nightmare. I'm sorry if I disturbed you. Dolly shook her head, approaching to offer him the cup. Dreams are messengers. Sometimes they bring warnings we must heed. The liquid in the cup smelled of herbs, something like mint but earthier. What is it? He asked. Tea, to calm the spirit. Enola taught me. Nate accepted the cup, taking a cautious sip. The taste was unfamiliar but not unpleasant, slightly sweet with a hint of bitterness underneath. Thank you. Dolly settled on the edge of the table, watching him with her characteristic intensity. You were a healer, yet you dream of failing to heal. Witian, the direct question caught Nate off guard. I don't know if I can explain. Try, Dolly suggested, without demand, but with clear interest. Nate took another sip of the tea, gathering his thoughts. During the war, I saw terrible things. Did terrible things, sometimes trying to save lives. Cut off limbs, dug bullets from flesh. Watched men die despite everything I knew how to do. He stared into the cup, seeing not the liquid, but memories. When I came home, I thought I was leaving that behind. Then Elizabeth died in childbirth, and I couldn't save her either. So you stopped being a healer, Dolly concluded. Yes, but you did not stop knowing how to heal. Nate looked up at her, struck by the simple truth of the observation. No, I suppose not. My husband was a warrior, Dolly said, her fingers absently touching the tattoo on her wrist. When he died, I wanted to stop being who I was too, to become nothing, like smoke from a dead fire. What changed? Time and necessity. A faint, sad smile touched her lips. We cannot stop being who we are, Nathaniel Sullivan. We can only choose how to use what we know. The insight resonated deeply. Nate had indeed stopped practicing medicine formally after Elizabeth's death, but he hadn't stopped using those skills, treating Hannah's illnesses, setting his own broken finger last winter, even assessing the Apache women when they first arrived. "You're very wise, Dolly," he said. She shook her head. "Not wise, only old enough to have seen patterns repeat." She stood, moving toward the door. "Drink all the tea, then sleep without dreams." After she'd gone, Nate finished the tea as instructed. Its warmth spread through him, easing some of the tension the nightmare had left behind. He lay back down, watching shadows play across the ceiling as clouds passed over the moon. Dolly was right. He couldn't stop being a healer any more than she could stop being a warrior's widow. They were shaped by their experiences, their losses, their skills. The question was not whether to acknowledge these aspects of themselves, but how to integrate them into the people they were becoming. For the first time in years, Nate found himself considering what it might mean to embrace his medical training again. Not as an army surgeon, but as something else. Something that could serve this small community they were building at Whispering Creek. The thought followed him into sleep, which came, as Dolly had promised, without further dreams. Morning dawned clear and still, the air holding that peculiar desert clarity that made distant objects seem close enough to touch. Nate rose early as usual, checking on Hannah before stepping outside to begin the day's chores. He found Ayanna already at the well, drawing water. She acknowledged him with a nod, her expression thoughtful. "Today," she said simply. Nate understood immediately. "Blackwood?" "Yes, I feel it." She hefted the water bucket, her strong arms managing its weight with practiced ease. "The birds are too quiet, and there was dust on the western ridge before sunrise. Riders passing." Whilst Nate had learned to trust Ayanna's instincts, she read the desert and its signs as fluently as any book. "How many do you think?" "4, perhaps 5. She poured some water into the washing basin, then handed Nate the dipper for a drink. "Enough to feel confident against 1 man and 3 women. "We should prepare," Nate said, taking a long drink before passing the dipper back. "Get Hannah somewhere safe." Ayanna nodded agreement. "Enola can take her to the canyon. There's a cave there where they will not be found. I'll speak with her after breakfast." Nate glanced toward the horizon, seeing nothing unusual, yet feeling the same sense of impending confrontation that Ayanna had described. "We should move supplies to the new cabin as well, create a fallback position if needed." For the next few hours, they worked with quiet efficiency, preparing without alarming Hannah. Enola packed a small bag with food and water, explaining to the child that they were going on a special expedition to collect rare plants in the canyon. Dolly positioned her bow and arrows in strategic locations around the property, while Ayanna and Nate moved essential supplies to the new cabin. By mid-morning, the sun beat down with fierce intensity, the sky a hard, relentless blue. Hannah and Enola had departed for their expedition, following a hidden path that would keep them out of sight from the main trail. Nate watched them go with a mixture of relief and anxiety, Enola's solemn promise to protect his daughter echoing in his mind. They came just before noon when heat shimmers danced above the distant ridges and even the insects had fallen silent. 5 riders, as Ayanna had predicted, with Blackwood in the lead. They approached without haste, making no attempt at stealth, their horses kicking up dust that hung in the still air like a signal flag. Nate stood on the porch of the main cabin, his revolver holstered but visible at his hip. Ayanna positioned herself near the corner of the building, a rifle that had belonged to Nate's father held with comfortable familiarity in her hands. Dolly had disappeared, but Nate knew she was nearby, likely perched on the barn roof with her bow ready. Blackwood reined in his horse about 20 yards from the cabin, his 4 companions fanning out in a loose semicircle behind him. All were armed, revolvers, rifles, one with a shotgun across his saddle. Their expressions ranged from grim determination to the loose-jawed anticipation of men expecting entertainment. "Sullivan," Blackwood called, not dismounting. "I see you're still harboring my property." "There's nothing here that belongs to you, Blackwood," Nate replied evenly. "Turn around and ride away while you still can." A ripple of laughter passed through Blackwood's men. One spat tobacco juice into the dust. Blackwood himself smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "I've got papers, Sullivan." He patted his breast pocket. Legal documents signed by Judge Harmon himself, declaring those Apache women as lawful bounty, captured while participating in hostilities against territorial citizens. That's a lie, Ayanna called from her position. We were peaceful, traveling to the reservation under military escort when your men took us. Blackwood's smile faltered slightly at her perfect English, but he recovered quickly. Apache can't testify in territorial court, woman. Your word means nothing against legal documents. And yet here we stand, Ayanna replied, raising the rifle to rest against her shoulder, not aiming but making her capability clear. Free women on free land. One of Blackwood's companions shifted nervously in his saddle. Another's hand drifted toward his holstered revolver. The tension in the air was palpable, shimmering like the heat waves above the distant hills. Last chance, Sullivan, Blackwood said, his voice hardening. Hand over the women, and we'll leave peacefully. Resist, and we'll take them anyway, after we've taught you what happens to men who steal from Ezra Blackwood. Nate's hand hovered near his revolver. 5 against 3 were poor odds, but they had the advantage of cover and preparation. And more importantly, they were fighting for their home, not merely profit or pride. They're not yours to take, Blackwood, he said, each word deliberate and clear. And this is our home. You're trespassing. Leave now. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Blackwood's face twisted with rage, his hand dropping to his gun. An arrow whistled through the air, striking the ground directly between Blackwood's horse's front hooves. The animal reared in panic, nearly unseating its rider. A second arrow followed immediately, piercing the canteen hanging from another man's saddle. Jesus Christ, one of the men shouted, drawing his revolver and firing wildly toward the barn. The shot went wide, splintering wood near the roof's edge. Next one goes through your eye, Dolly's voice called from somewhere above, cool and certain. Chaos erupted. 2 of Blackwood's men fired toward the barn, while another aimed at Nate. Ayanna's rifle cracked sharply, the bullet striking the shooter's arm and sending his weapon spinning to the ground. The man screamed, clutching his bleeding forearm. Nate drew his revolver and fired at the man nearest Blackwood, aiming for his shoulder. The shot went high, but the bullet's passage close to the man's ear was enough to make him duck and curse. Blackwood himself had regained control of his horse and drawn his own revolver. He fired twice toward the porch, forcing Nate to dive for cover as splinters flew from the wooden railing. A third shot from Blackwood struck the water barrel near Ayanna, sending a spray of liquid across the dusty ground. An arrow from Dolly found its mark in the thigh of one of the men, who howled in pain and dropped his rifle. Ayanna fired again, the bullet kicking up dust directly in front of Blackwood's horse, causing the animal to shy sideways. Fall back! Blackwood shouted to his men, firing once more toward the cabin before wheeling his horse around. This isn't over, Sullivan. The wounded men struggled to control their mounts as they retreated, one still cursing and clutching his bleeding arm, the other trying to snap off the shaft of the arrow protruding from his thigh. The remaining 2 provided covering fire, sending bullets thudding into the cabin walls and nearby trees. Nate and Ayanna kept low, returning fire sparingly, more to hasten the retreat than to inflict further injury. Dolly sent one final arrow after the fleeing men, deliberately missing but coming close enough to speed their departure. Within minutes, the homestead was silent again, save for the ringing in Nate's ears from the gunfire. Dust hung in the air where the riders had passed, gradually settling back to earth in the still afternoon heat. Ayanna rose from her position, checking the rifle's chamber before lowering it. They will return, she said, her voice steady despite the danger they'd just faced. With more men. I know, Nate agreed, holstering his revolver. But we've bought time. Shown them we won't be easily overwhelmed. Dolly appeared from the direction of the barn, her bow in hand and her quiver noticeably lighter. There was a small cut on her cheek where a splinter or bullet fragment had grazed her, but she seemed otherwise unharmed. 2 wounded, she said with professional assessment, 1 seriously. They will need to seek help in town. Which means Cooper will hear about this before nightfall, Nate concluded. We need to be ready for whatever comes next. Ayanna nodded agreement, her eyes scanning the horizon where Blackwood and his men had disappeared. We should check on Enola and Hannah, make sure they remain hidden until we know it's safe. As they stood in the aftermath of the brief but violent confrontation, Nate was struck by how naturally they had worked together, not as protector and protected, but as equals defending a shared home. Whatever boundaries had existed between them at the beginning had blurred in the face of common danger. "Thank you," he said, looking from Ayana to Dolly, "for standing with me." Dolly touched her tattoo briefly, a gesture that had become familiar to Nate. "We stand together," she said simply, "or we do not stand at all." The words echoed in Nate's mind as they moved to secure the homestead and check for damage from the gunfire. Stand together. Not out of obligation or necessity, but by choice. It was a foundation stronger than any cabin wall they'd built, a commitment forged in shared danger and mutual respect. Whatever came next, they would face it as they had faced Blackwood, united in defense of the home they were building together at Whispering Creek. The morning after the gunfight brought a deceptive calm to Whispering Creek. Sunlight slanted through the trees, casting dappled patterns across the yard as though nothing had changed. But everything had. From the porch, Nate watched Hannah and Enola in the garden. The young woman was teaching his daughter how to identify herbs that could be used for healing, and Hannah followed her instructions with rapt attention. Their voices drifted to him in fragments, soft questions, gentle answers, a scene of perfect tranquility that belied the violence of yesterday. "It's hard to believe," Nate said quietly as Ayana appeared beside him, "that just hours ago we were fighting for our lives." Ayana followed his gaze to where Hannah was carefully digging around a small plant. "Children remind us that life continues, even after battle." She studied his profile. "You're troubled, not by the fight itself, but by what comes next." Nate nodded, appreciating as always her ability to read him. "Hannah's world has changed forever, and I'm the one who changed it." "No," Ayana said firmly. "Blackwood and men like him changed it. You simply refuse to accept their terms." She placed a hand briefly on his arm, a rare gesture from her. "Children are more resilient than we believe. Look at her." Hannah was laughing now, holding up a dirt-covered root for Enola's inspection. Her face shone with accomplishment, unmarked by the fear that had shadowed it just days ago. "She's found her place," Nate observed with quiet wonder. "With all of you, as we have found ours with you." Ayana's gaze shifted to the bullet holes in the cabin wall, a stark reminder of yesterday's confrontation. "But our enemies have not forgotten us. Cooper's warning gives us little time." Nate glanced toward the damaged water barrel. "We need to decide what happens next, whether we fight or find another way," Ayana finished for him. "Another place, perhaps." The suggestion hung between them, weighted with implications. Leave Whispering Creek, the home he had built with Elizabeth, where Hannah had taken her first steps? Yet even as the thought pained him, Nate felt the first stirrings of something unexpected. Not resignation, but possibility. The last word hung between them, weighted with implication. Decide what? Whether to flee, to surrender, to fight to the bitter end? Before Nate could ask, a sound from the canyon path drew their attention. Dolly appeared, leading Hannah and Enola back toward the homestead. The little girl ran ahead when she spotted her father, her face alight with excitement rather than fear. "Papa!" Hannah called, launching herself into his arms with complete trust. "We found the most amazing cave. It has paintings on the walls, really old ones. Enola says her ancestors made them hundreds of years ago." Nate hugged her tightly, relief washing through him at having her safely back. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart." Over Hannah's shoulder, he met Enola's eyes. She gave a slight nod, confirming without words that they had remained safe, unaware of the violence that had erupted at the homestead. The silent communication reminded Nate again of how quickly they had become attuned to each other, developing the shorthand of family. "Why is there mud on the house?" Hannah asked, noticing the repair work. "And what happened to the water barrel?" Nate exchanged glances with Ayana, seeking the right balance between truth and protection. "There was some trouble while you were gone," he said carefully. "Mr. Blackwood came back with some friends. They weren't very nice." Hannah's small brow furrowed. "Did they want to take Ayana and Dolly and Enola away?" "Yes," Nate admitted, "but we didn't let them." The child considered this with surprising gravity. "Good," she declared finally. "They belong here with us." Such simple certainty, Nate thought. Children saw through to essentials while adults tangled themselves in complications. "Yes, they do," he agreed, setting her down gently. Why don't you help Enola gather some fresh water from the creek? Our barrel has a leak. As Hannah skipped away with Enola, Dolly approached Nate and Ayana, her expression grim. I checked the trails, she reported quietly. They've gone back to town, but one left blood all the way, the one with the arrow in his leg. Will he survive? Nate asked, medical instincts surfacing despite everything. If they get the arrow out cleanly and stop the bleeding, Dolly replied with professional assessment, but he will carry the mark forever, as will the other. Now there was no satisfaction in her voice, only factual reporting. Yet Nate sensed that for Dolly, whose husband had been a warrior, there was a certain justice in their successful defense of Whispering Creek. They had stood their ground. They had protected what was theirs. As the day waned into evening, they continued repairing the damage, working together with the easy coordination they'd developed over weeks. When darkness fell, they gathered in the main cabin for a simple meal, the mood subdued but not defeated. Hannah chattered about the cave paintings, seemingly oblivious to the adults' concerns, though Nate noticed how she stayed closer to him than usual, as if sensing the undercurrents of tension. After Hannah was asleep, the four adults sat around the table, a single lamp casting long shadows across their faces. The time had come for difficult conversations. We need to decide what happens next, Nate began, echoing Ayana's earlier words. Cooper gave us 1 week. 3 days have passed, and now we've wounded Blackwood's men. They'll be back, with more guns and, perhaps, the law on their side. Enola glanced toward the small room where Hannah slept. The child needs safety, she said softly. Above all else. We could leave, Dolly suggested, her voice neutral. Disappear into the mountains. We know how to survive there. And abandon the home we've built? Ayana challenged. Give Blackwood victory without further fight? It's not victory if we live free elsewhere, Dolly countered. Nate listened to their exchange, struck by how they discussed options as equal stakeholders in Whispering Creek's fate. This wasn't his decision alone anymore. It belonged to all of them. What about the reservation? He asked, voicing the option they had all avoided. San Carlos? Cooper said you'd be safe there. Ayana's expression hardened. Safe, perhaps? Free? No. She leaned forward, her eyes intense in the lamplight. The reservation is a cage with invisible bars. They control what we eat, where we sleep, how we pray. Children are taken to mission schools to forget their language and customs. I lived that life once, Nathaniel. I will not return to it willingly. Nor I, Dolly agreed quietly. Enola remained silent, her gaze distant, perhaps remembering her lost child or imagining Hannah in such a place. Nate rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of their collective future pressing down. Then we have two choices: stand and fight, knowing we're outnumbered, or leave together, all of us, and start over somewhere new. The proposition hung in the air, laden with implications. Abandoning Whispering Creek meant abandoning the home he'd built with Elizabeth, the place where Hannah had been born, where he'd buried his grief and begun to heal. Yet staying might mean bloodshed, perhaps worse than today's brief skirmish. This is your home, Ayana said after a long silence. Your daughter's inheritance. We would not ask you to leave it. It's our home now, Nate corrected gently. All of us. And what matters isn't the land or the buildings, but the people who share them. Something shifted in Ayana's expression, a softening around the eyes, a vulnerability she rarely displayed. You would leave everything you've built here? For us? With you, Nate clarified. Not for you. There's a difference. A faint smile touched her lips, recognizing his echo of their earlier conversation. Yes, she agreed, there is. Before the discussion could continue, a sound outside caught their attention. Hoofbeats, approaching slowly in the darkness. Everyone tensed, Dolly reaching for her knife while Ayana moved toward the rifle propped by the door. Nate held up a hand, listening carefully. One rider, he said, coming openly, not trying to hide. He took his revolver from its holster on the wall and stepped outside, the others following close behind. The night was clear, stars offering just enough light to make out a solitary figure on horseback, approaching the homestead at a walk. As the rider drew closer, the starlight revealed a familiar silhouette. Evening, Sullivan, Sheriff Cooper called, reining his horse to a stop at a respectful distance. I'd appreciate it if nobody starts shooting. That depends on why you're here, Nate replied, keeping his revolver lowered but ready. Bit late for social calls. Cooper dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He left his rifle in its saddle holster, a sign of peaceful intentions, though his pistol remained at his hip. Got 2 injured men in town, he said, approaching the pool of lamplight spilling from the cabin door. One with a bullet in his arm, another with an arrow in his thigh. Blackwood's raising hell, talking about murder attempts and stolen property. They came armed to our home, Ayanna spoke up, stepping forward to stand beside Nate. Fired first. We defended ourselves. Cooper's gaze shifted to her, then to Dolly and Enola, who stood in the doorway. That may be true, he acknowledged, but it won't matter much to a territorial judge who sees 3 Apache women living off-reservation with a white man. Why are you here, Cooper? Nate asked directly. To arrest us? Warn us? What? The sheriff sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his thinning hair. I'm here unofficially, Sullivan. Man to man. He glanced around the homestead, taking in the bullet holes and repairs. Blackwood's gathering men, at least a dozen, maybe more. They're planning to ride out here at dawn, with or without my authority. A chill ran through Nate despite the mild night. And will they have your authority? Cooper replaced his hat, his expression grim in the dim light. Judge Harper's sending a writ. Should arrive on tomorrow's stage. Once I have that paper in hand, I'm obligated to enforce it. What does the writ say? Ayanna demanded. Haven't seen it, Cooper admitted. But knowing Harper, it'll declare these women as escaped prisoners of war to be returned to proper custody, meaning Blackwood, or escorted to San Carlos Reservation. Nate felt rather than saw the women's reactions. Ayanna's quiet fury, Dolly's tense readiness, Enola's silent dread. Why tell us this? He asked Cooper. Why not just arrive with Blackwood's men and the writ? The sheriff was quiet for a moment, seeming to choose his words carefully. Been lawman in these parts 15 years, Sullivan. Seen all kinds of injustice wearing the clothes of law. He gestured toward the women. Don't much care who lives on your homestead or how, but I do care about avoiding bloodshed where possible. So you're warning us to run, Nate concluded. I'm saying if anyone was planning to be elsewhere come dawn, this would be a good night for traveling. Cooper remounted his horse with a grunt. That's all I came to say. What you do with it is your business. He tipped his hat once, then turned his horse and rode back into the darkness, leaving them to contemplate the stark warning. Inside the cabin, they reconvened around the table, the mood now urgent rather than contemplative. Cooper's visit had transformed an abstract threat into immediate danger. We have until dawn, Nate summarized. 6, maybe 7 hours. Ayanna's mind was already working tactically. We can gather essential supplies, take the horses, be miles away before they arrive. Where would we go? Enola asked, her voice barely above a whisper. North, Dolly suggested, toward the mountains. There are places there where they would not find us. Nate nodded slowly, his thoughts racing ahead to practicalities. We'd need water, food, blankets. The nights are cold in the high country this time of year. Hannah's medicine, Enola added, and seeds from the garden, for when we find a new place. The simple phrase, a new place, hung in the air, a commitment to continuing together whatever came. Nate felt a surge of something like hope amid the urgency of their planning. They were thinking not just of escape, but of rebuilding, of future. I'll wake Hannah and prepare her, he decided, rising from the table. Ayanna, you and Dolly gather what supplies you can carry. Enola, collect your herbs and medicines. We'll leave within the hour. As they dispersed to their tasks, Nate paused in the doorway of the small room where Hannah slept peacefully, unaware that her world was about to change again. He steeled himself for the conversation ahead, knowing that children were more resilient than adults often gave them credit for, yet fearing her reaction nonetheless. He sat gently on the edge of her bed, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. Hannah, he whispered, wake up, sweetheart. I need to talk to you. Her eyes fluttered open, cloudy with sleep. Papa, is it morning? No, little one, but we need to go on a journey, tonight. Hannah sat up, suddenly more alert. A journey? Where? Nate chose his words carefully. Somewhere new. Somewhere safe. We're all going together. You, me, Ayana, Dolly, and Enola. Because of the bad men who came today? Hannah asked perceptively. Yes, Nate admitted. They might come back with more bad men, so we need to find a new home. He braced for tears or protests, but Hannah surprised him with her response. Will I get to bring my doll and my drawings? Relief washed through him. Yes, of course. We'll bring everything important, but we can only take what we can carry, so we need to choose carefully. Hannah nodded solemnly, sliding from bed and reaching for her small wooden box where she kept treasured items. The doll Nate had carved for her third birthday, a ribbon that had belonged to Elizabeth, pebbles and feathers collected from around the homestead. As she sorted through her precious collection, deciding what must come and what could be left behind, Nate marveled at her adaptability. Children live more completely in the present than adults, less burdened by past attachments. Hannah had already incorporated the Apache women into her understanding of family. Now she would incorporate a new home as well, wherever that might be. Within the hour, they had gathered essential supplies: food, water, blankets, tools, medicines, weapons, and seeds from Enola's garden. The two horses were laden with as much as they could reasonably carry. They would travel on foot, leading the animals, moving quietly through the desert night toward the distant mountains that loomed black against the star-filled sky. As they prepared to depart, Nate stood for a moment on the porch of the main cabin, looking back at the homestead he had built with such hope and inhabited with such grief. Whispering Creek had been his refuge, his penance, his prison, and finally, briefly, his joy. Leaving it felt like abandoning Elizabeth all over again, though he knew rationally that her memory lived in his heart, not in logs and stones. Ayana joined him, reading his thoughts as she so often did. We can return someday, she said quietly, when Blackwood is gone or the law has forgotten us. Perhaps, Nate agreed, though they both knew the likelihood was small. Once abandoned, homesteads quickly fell to ruin in the harsh desert environment. Wild animals would claim the buildings. Weather would wear away the signs of human habitation. In a year or two, Whispering Creek might look as though no one had ever lived there at all. Hannah tugged at his hand, eager to begin what she still saw as an adventure. Come on, Papa. Enola says we need to walk while the stars are bright to show us the way. With a final glance at the cabin, at the life he was leaving behind, Nate turned away. You're right, he told Hannah, squeezing her small hand gently. Let's follow the stars. They set off in single file, Dolly leading the way with her hunter's instinct for terrain, followed by Enola and Hannah, then the two laden horses, with Nate and Ayana bringing up the rear. The only sounds were the soft crunch of boots on desert soil and the occasional snort from the horses. Behind them, Whispering Creek gradually faded into the darkness, becoming just another shadow among many. Dawn found them deep in the foothills of the northern mountains, having traveled steadily through the night. They made camp in a sheltered draw where a small spring provided fresh water, one of Dolly's hunting discoveries from previous explorations. Exhausted from the journey, Hannah fell asleep almost immediately, curled beside Enola under a blanket in the shade of a juniper tree. While Dolly scouted the surrounding area to ensure they hadn't been followed, Nate and Ayana took stock of their situation. They had traveled perhaps 15 miles as the crow flies, though the winding trail through rugged terrain had made the journey longer. They were beyond the immediate reach of Blackwood and his men, who would likely spend the morning searching the area around Whispering Creek before realizing their quarry had fled. We should rest today, Ayana suggested, her voice husky with fatigue. Continue north tonight when it's cooler and we're less visible. Nate nodded agreement, surveying the temporary camp. It offered decent protection, water, shade, and good visibility of the approach from the south. How far to the high country? He asked. 3 days, perhaps 4 with the child and horses, Ayana estimated. There's a valley Dolly knows, hidden among the peaks. Few white men have ever seen it. The prospect of such isolation was both reassuring and daunting. Safety, yes, but at the cost of complete separation from the world Nate had known. No more supplies from town, no possibility of sending Hannah to school eventually, no contact with other settlers. Yet looking at his sleeping daughter, peaceful despite the upheaval, Nate knew he would accept these sacrifices and more to protect his newfound family. Hannah had already lost one mother. He wouldn't allow her to lose 3 more parental figures because of prejudice and greed. Dolly returned from her scouting, moving so silently that Nate didn't notice her approach until she was nearly upon them. No signs of pursuit, she reported, but I found something else. Tracks to the north, fresh ones. Ayana tensed. What kind of tracks? Apache, Dolly replied. A small group, maybe 6 people, moving east to west across our path about a mile ahead. The information hung between them, laden with possibility and risk. Other Apache in these mountains could mean potential allies, or potential complications if they were from a band hostile to Ayana, Dolly, or Enola's people. Could you tell which band? Ayana asked. Dolly shook her head. The signs were not specific, but they travel with a child, I think. There were small footprints among the larger ones. Nate considered their options. Should we avoid them? Change our route? Ayana and Dolly exchanged one of their wordless glances, communicating in that silent language they shared. Finally, Ayana turned back to Nate. We should make contact, she decided. Carefully, Apache in these mountains might have information we need about safe passages, water sources, soldier patrols. She paused, then added more softly, and Hannah should see that we are not alone in this world, that there are others like us who live free. The logic was sound, though Nate felt a flutter of anxiety at the prospect of encountering strangers in their vulnerable state. Still, he trusted Ayana and Dolly's judgment in this matter far more than his own. How do we approach them safely, he asked. Dolly will track them, Ayana explained. When she locates their camp, I will approach openly, without weapons, speaking our language. If they are peaceful, they will invite me to sit. If not, she shrugged, leaving the alternative unspoken. I'll go with you, Nate said immediately. Ayana shook her head. Your presence would only create suspicion. A white man with Apache women is unusual enough to raise questions we cannot answer quickly. She placed a hand briefly on his arm, a rare gesture of physical contact. Trust us in this, Nathaniel, as we have trusted you in your world. Put that way, Nate could hardly refuse. All right, he conceded, but be careful. A faint smile touched Ayana's lips. Always. They rested through the heat of the day, conserving energy and water. Hannah woke briefly for a meal, excited by the new surroundings, but drowsy enough to fall back asleep afterward. Nate marveled again at her resilience, her ability to find adventure rather than hardship in their circumstances. As the shadows lengthened into evening, Dolly prepared to track the Apache group she'd discovered. She would go ahead alone, locate their camp, and return with information before Ayana attempted contact. She carried only her knife and a small water skin, traveling light for speed and stealth. Be back before moonrise, Ayana instructed as Dolly prepared to depart. Dolly nodded once, touching her wrist tattoo briefly, the gesture Nate had come to recognize as her way of drawing strength from her husband's memory. Then she slipped away into the gathering dusk, her form quickly disappearing among the juniper and pinyon pines that dotted the foothills. The waiting was difficult. Nate busied himself, checking their supplies and tending to the horses. But his thoughts kept returning to Dolly moving alone through potentially dangerous territory and to what Ayana might face when she followed. They had become so integrated into his life that the prospect of harm befalling any of them was physically painful to contemplate. Hannah seemed to sense his unease. She sat beside him as he adjusted the horse's hobbles, her small face serious in the fading light. Is Dolly coming back, Papa? Of course she is, Nate assured her, more confidently than he felt. She's just scouting ahead to make sure our path is safe. Hannah nodded, accepting this explanation. Enola says there might be other Apache nearby. Will they be our friends? I hope so, Nate said honestly. Ayana and Dolly will talk to them first to make sure. Good, Hannah declared. We need more friends if we're going to build a new home. The simple wisdom in her statement caught Nate by surprise. Yes, they did need friends, allies in this wilderness where they were effectively outlaws. The isolated existence he'd envisioned might not be sustainable for long, especially with a growing child. Moonrise came and went with no sign of Dolly. Nate's anxiety grew with each passing hour, though Ayana remained outwardly calm, her eyes fixed on the northern darkness from which Dolly should emerge. Enola distracted Hannah with quiet stories until the child finally drifted off to sleep again, leaving the adults to their tense vigil. It was well past midnight when a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness at the edge of their camp. Dolly materialized like a spirit, her expression grave as she approached the small fire they'd allowed themselves. "I found them," she reported without preamble. "A small band, 3 women, 2 men, 3 children. They have made camp beside a stream in the next valley." "Did they see you?" Ayana asked. "No, I was careful." Dolly settled beside the fire, accepting a cup of water from Nate with a nod of thanks. "But they are not travelers. They have a shelter of branches, cook fires, drying racks for meat. They have been there some time." This was unexpected news. Most Apache in the territory had been forced onto reservations years ago. A free band living openly in these mountains was unusual and potentially significant for their own plans. "Could you tell which people?" Ayana pressed. "Chiricahua, I think," Dolly replied, "from their dress and the pattern of their camp. But there was something else." She paused, her expression troubled. "One of the men is white." Silence fell as they absorbed this information. A white man living among free Apache was as unusual as their own arrangement at Whispering Creek had been. It could indicate a situation similar to theirs, or something more complex. "We should still make contact," Ayana decided after consideration. At first light, but cautiously. Nate's protective instincts surged. "I'm coming with you," he said in a tone that brooked no argument. "If there's another white man there, my presence won't seem so strange." Ayana studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well, but we approach openly, without weapons, and Hannah stays here with Enola until we know it's safe." They settled the details of their approach as the night deepened around them. By the time they'd finished planning, the first hint of dawn was lightening the eastern sky. Nate checked on Hannah, still sleeping peacefully under Enola's watchful eye, then joined Ayana at the edge of camp where Dolly waited to guide them. "Ready?" Ayana asked quietly. Nate nodded, suddenly aware of how far they'd come from that day in Twin Forks when he'd impulsively paid $6 for the freedom of 3 strangers. Now he was following them into unknown territory, trusting their judgment, placing his fate and Hannah's in their hands. And he wouldn't have it any other way. They walked in silence through the pre-dawn darkness, Dolly leading them along a winding path that followed natural contours of the land. As the sky lightened from black to deep blue to pale gray, details of the terrain emerged. Rocky outcroppings, stands of juniper and pine, dry washes that would become rushing torrents during the brief, violent summer thunderstorms. The landscape was harsh but beautiful in its stark simplicity. Nate found himself appreciating its wild dignity, so different from the more cultivated environment he'd known in his youth back east. This land demanded respect and offered no compromises, yet it provided for those who understood its rhythms and requirements. The Apache had thrived here for centuries before white settlement disrupted their way of life, a testament to their resilience and adaptability. As the first golden light touched the highest peaks, Dolly halted at the crest of a small rise, gesturing for Nate and Ayana to join her. Below them lay a narrow valley, bisected by a small stream that glinted silver in the early light. Near the water stood a cluster of structures, not teepees as Nate might have expected, but low, dome-shaped shelters made of branches covered with hides and canvas. Smoke rose from several small fires, and figures moved about the camp, beginning their day. From this distance, Nate couldn't distinguish individuals clearly, but the scene appeared peaceful and well-established. "We approach from here," Ayana said, pointing to a clear path leading down to the stream. "Openly, where they can see us coming. I will call out in Chiricahua when we're close enough. If they're hostile, we retreat immediately." "Understood?" Nate and Dolly both nodded. Leaving their weapons behind as planned, they descended toward the valley floor, making no attempt to conceal their approach. Nate's heart pounded with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. So much depended on how this encounter unfolded. Not just their immediate safety, but potentially their future in these mountains. They were halfway to the camp when they were spotted. Activity ceased as figures turned toward them, several disappearing briefly into shelters only to emerge with weapons in hand. Nate tensed but continued forward at Ayana's side, trusting her judgment. When they were perhaps 100 yards from the camp, Ayana called out in the musical, complex language Nate had heard her use with Dolian and Enola. Her voice carried clearly in the morning air, the unfamiliar words somehow conveying reassurance despite Nate's inability to understand them. A long moment of silence followed. Then one of the men stepped forward, calling back in the same language. Ayana responded, gesturing toward Nate and Dolly. More exchanges followed, the tone seeming to shift from wariness to cautious interest. Finally, the man gestured for them to approach. As they drew closer, Nate could see him more clearly. Middle-aged, with the weathered features of the Apache, but wearing a mixture of traditional clothing and items clearly of white origin, including a cavalry officer's jacket modified with beadwork and fringe. Behind him stood the second man Dolly had mentioned, and Nate was startled to see that he was indeed white. Perhaps in his 50s, with a full beard streaked with the gray and the leathery skin of someone who had lived outdoors for decades. He wore buckskins like a mountain man of old, but with Apache decorative elements similar to those worn by the others. The Apache man spoke again, this time in heavily accented but understandable English. I am Kianata. This is our camp. Ayana says you come in peace, seeking shelter. Is this true? Yes, Nate replied, inclining his head respectfully. I'm Nathaniel Sullivan. We're traveling north, looking for a safe place. Kianata studied him intently. Safe from what? Nate glanced at Ayana, unsure how much to reveal. She gave a slight nod, encouraging honesty. From men who believe these women belong to them, Nate said, and from a law that would force them onto the reservation against their will. The white man behind Kianata stepped forward, his pale blue eyes sharp with interest. You bought them, then freed them? He asked, his voice rough with disuse of English. Something like that, Nate acknowledged. A smile creased the man's weathered face. Well, I'll be damned. Thomas Mitchell. He extended a hand which Nate shook automatically. Did much the same myself about 20 years back. Except it was just the one woman, Helona, my wife. He gestured toward one of the women watching from near the central fire. The revelation stunned Nate. Another white man who had purchased an Apache woman's freedom, who had chosen to live with her people rather than force her into his world. The parallels were striking, though Mitchell appeared to have gone native in a way Nate never had. Kianata spoke again, addressing Ayana in their language. She replied at length, occasionally gesturing toward Nate or Dolly. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Kianata nodding thoughtfully at times. Finally, he turned back to Nate. Ayana says you have a child and another woman in your camp nearby. Bring them here. Share our fire and food while we talk more. The invitation, for that's what it clearly was, sent a wave of relief through Nate. This first hurdle had been crossed successfully. They had found, if not yet allies, at least not enemies. Thank you, he said simply. We'll return soon. As they walked back toward their own camp, Nate could hardly contain his questions. What did you tell him? He asked Ayana. What did he say? I told him our story, how you purchased our freedom, how we built a home together, how Blackwood and the law forced us to flee. Ayana's expression was guarded but hopeful. He knows of Blackwood. Many Apache do. He is willing to hear more, to consider allowing us to stay in this valley for a time. Mitchell's presence seems to have helped, Dolly observed. He understands your position. Yes, Ayana agreed, though he has gone much further in adopting Apache ways than you have, Nathaniel. He has lived with them for 20 years, taken a wife, raised children who consider themselves Apache first, white second. The information gave Nate much to consider as they returned to their camp, where Enola and Hannah awaited news anxiously. Hannah was delighted to learn there were other children in the Apache camp, while Enola seemed relieved at the prospect of company beyond their small group. They gathered their essential belongings, leaving the horses hobbled near water and grass. They would return for them later if all went well, and made their way back to Kianata's camp as a complete group. Hannah skipped ahead with Enola, excited by the adventure, while Nate found himself wondering what this unexpected development meant for their future. The welcome at the Apache camp was cautious but genuine. Food was shared, a stew of rabbit and wild plants that Hannah approached warily, but then ate with surprising enthusiasm. The children, after initial shyness, began to play together despite the language barrier, inventing games that required no translation. Mitchell proved eager to speak English again, pulling Nate aside as the women conversed in Apache. Never thought I'd see another white man do what I did, he admitted, watching as his wife Helona spoke with Ayana. Most think I went crazy living like this. Gone Injun, they'd say. It wasn't my plan, Nate confessed. It just happened one step at a time. Mitchell chuckled, the sound rusty from disuse. That's how life works out here. No room for grand plans, just one day after another, making choices that keep you alive. And if you're lucky, bring some happiness along the way. He studied Nate with shrewd eyes. Which one's yours? Mine? Your woman, the one you bought first, meaning to keep. Nate felt heat rise to his face. It wasn't like that. I bought all three together to free them. There was no intent beyond that. Mitchell's eyebrows rose skeptically. And now you travel together, protect each other, raise a child together. Looks like family to me. The observation struck uncomfortably close to Nate's unspoken feelings. Yes, they had become a family of sorts, but the exact nature of his relationship with Ayanna, Dolly, and Enola remained undefined, deliberately so. There had been no romantic overtures, no declarations, just a gradual intertwining of lives and purposes. It's complicated, he said, finally. Mitchell laughed again, more naturally this time. Ain't it always? Well, word of advice from someone in who's walked this path, don't fight it. Out here, you take happiness where you find it. Everything else is just details. Before Nate could respond, Kianada approached, accompanied by Ayanna. The Apache leader's expression was solemn but not unfriendly. We have talked, he said to Nate. Your woman Ayanna has told us of your journey, of the danger that follows you. He paused, seemingly choosing his words carefully. We live here in peace, hidden from soldiers and settlers. We wish to remain hidden. Nate's heart sank, sensing rejection in these words. We understand. We'll continue north. Kianada held up a hand, stopping him. But we also know what it means to flee from those who would cage us, to seek freedom. His gaze moved to Hannah, who was learning a string game from one of the Apache children, her face alight with concentration and joy. And we see that your child is happy among our children, that your women speak our language and follow our ways in many things. He looked back at Nate, his decision made. You may stay in this valley, but not in our camp. There is another good site for a camp upstream, with water and shelter. Close enough for safety, far enough for privacy. You will build your own home there, hunt your own food, live by your own ways. The offer was more than Nate had dared hope for. Not full integration, but acceptance and proximity. A chance to establish a new life with the security of allies nearby. Thank you, he said sincerely. We accept your generosity. Kianata nodded once, then added with unexpected insight. Perhaps your family and Mitchell's family can build a bridge between our peoples. A small one, but real. The word family echoed in Nate's mind as Kianata moved away to speak with the other Apache men. Yes, that's what they had become, regardless of the unconventional path that had brought them together. A family forged not by blood or law or tradition, but by choice and circumstance and growing affection. That evening, as they sat around the communal fire, Nate watched Hannah playing contentedly with the Apache children, already picking up words in their language with a child's effortless acquisition. He saw Enola deep in conversation with an older Apache woman about medicinal plants, their shared knowledge transcending cultural differences. Dolly had found common ground with one of the Apache men, comparing hunting techniques and territories. And Ayanna sat beside him, her profile strong against the firelight, her expression more relaxed than he had ever seen it. Feeling his gaze, she turned toward him, a question in her eyes. Happy? He asked softly. She considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. Content, she decided. For now, that is enough. It was enough, Nate realized. After years of grief and isolation, after weeks of uncertainty and danger, contentment was a precious gift. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, building shelter, establishing routines, negotiating the complex relationship with Kianata's band. But tonight, sitting beside Ayanna with Hannah's laughter in his ears and the knowledge that Dolly and Enola were safe nearby, Nate allowed himself to feel something he had almost forgotten. Hope. Later, as the camp settled for the night, Mitchell approached Nate one last time. Meant to give you this, he said, pressing something small and cold into Nate's palm. Might come in handy someday. Nate opened his hand to find a simple ring fashioned from silver, decorated with a small turquoise stone. What's this for? Mitchell winked, his weathered face creasing with humor. When you figure out which one's your woman. Apache tradition. Halona taught me. You give it when you're ready. With that cryptic advice, he moved away, leaving Nate staring at the small circle of metal gleaming in the dying firelight. The ring felt impossibly weighted with implication. Nate slipped it into his pocket, not ready to examine what it represented or the choice it suggested. That was a matter for another day, when they were settled, when the future felt more certain. For now, it was enough to know they had found refuge, that Hannah would sleep safely tonight, that tomorrow they would begin building a new home, together. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the early sun painting the valley in hues of gold and amber. Nate woke to find Hannah already up, playing with the Apache children under Enola's watchful eye. The easy way his daughter had adapted to these new circumstances never ceased to amaze him. Further evidence of her resilience and capacity for joy despite the upheavals in her young life. After a simple breakfast shared with Kianata's band, they prepared to move to their own campsite upstream. Mitchell offered to guide them, bringing along his oldest son to help establish their new home. The boy, about 16, moved with the fluid grace of his Apache heritage, but had his father's pale eyes, a striking combination that spoke to the blending of worlds that had occurred in this hidden valley. As they gathered their few possessions and prepared to depart, Ayana approached Nate with something held carefully in her hands, a small pouch made of deer hide, decorated with beadwork and geometric patterns. A gift, she explained, offering it to him, from Kianata's wife, for protection in our new home. Nate accepted the pouch, touched by the gesture from people who had every reason to distrust anyone with white skin. Please thank her for me, he said. For all of us. Ayana nodded, then hesitated, something uncharacteristically uncertain in her expression. Nathaniel, she began, using his full name as she always did in serious moments. Last night you asked if I was happy. I gave you an incomplete answer. Oh, Nate prompted when she paused. Happiness is not something I expected to find again in this life, Ayana continued, her voice low and measured. After what was taken from me, my husband, my home, my freedom, I thought survival was the most I could hope for. Her dark eyes met his, direct and unflinching. But here, with you and Hannah, with Dolly and Enola, I have found more than survival. I have found purpose, connection. She paused again, seeming to search for the right word. Family, she concluded softly. The simple declaration from a woman who rarely spoke of personal feelings moved Nate deeply. Yes, he agreed, family. Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of what had been growing during their weeks together, through shared work and danger and quiet evenings. Not romance in any conventional sense, but a bond equally profound. Mitchell approached, interrupting the moment with practical concerns. Tide's waiting, and he announced, gesturing toward his son. Best get moving if we want to have shelter built before nightfall. Nate nodded, tucking the gifted pouch safely into his shirt. There would be time later for deeper conversations, for decisions about the exact nature of their relationships. For now, they had a home to build. Their new campsite proved to be a small clearing beside the stream, sheltered by tall pines and offering good visibility in all directions. Natural rock formations provided windbreaks and potential foundations for more permanent structures. Game trails crisscrossed the area, promising hunting opportunities, and Enola immediately identified several medicinal plants growing nearby. Good land, Mitchell approved as they surveyed the site. Defensible, fertile, hidden from casual view. You'll do well here. They worked through the day, cutting branches for temporary shelters, clearing ground for fire pits, establishing the basic infrastructure of a camp that might, in time, become a more permanent settlement. Mitchell and his son showed them Apache techniques for building brush shelters, simple but effective protection from sun and casual rain that could be improved upon as time and resources allowed. Hannah helped in her way, gathering smaller branches and stones, chattering excitedly about having her own house near the stream. Watching her, Nate felt a profound sense of rightness despite the circumstances that had brought them here. His daughter was thriving among these unconventional caregivers, learning things she would never have discovered at Whispering Creek, developing a confidence and curiosity that had been muted during their more isolated existence. By late afternoon, they had established a functional camp, 3 brush shelters arranged in a rough semicircle around a central fire pit, with clear sight lines to approach routes and easy access to water. Mitchell and his son prepared to return to their own camp, having provided invaluable assistance and guidance. "We'll bring your horses tomorrow," Mitchell promised. "And Helena wants to show your women the best places to gather basket materials and edible plants." "Thank you," Nate said sincerely, "for everything." Mitchell shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Just neighbors helping neighbors. Way it should be." He hesitated, then added more seriously, "Word of advice, Sullivan. Don't wait too long to decide what kind of family you're building here. Life's shorter than you think, especially in these mountains." With that parting wisdom, he and his son departed, leaving Nate to ponder his words as they settled into their first evening in the new camp. Hannah, exhausted from the day's excitement, fell asleep early in the shelter she would share with Enola. Dolly took first watch, positioned at the camp's edge with her bow close at hand, old habits of caution dying hard despite the relative safety of their new location. Nate found himself sitting beside the small fire with Ayana, reminiscent of so many evenings at Whispering Creek. Above them, stars appeared one by one as twilight deepened into true night, familiar constellations that had guided their journey north. "Do you think Blackwood will track us this far?" Nate asked, voicing the concern that had lingered despite their apparent escape. Ayana considered the question with her usual thoroughness. "Perhaps. He is stubborn and prideful, but these mountains are difficult for those who don't know them. And there are many Apache still free who would not welcome his kind in their territory." "So we're safe here?" "Safety is always relative," she replied pragmatically. "But yes, safer than we were." She gestured toward the rough camp they had established. "And we can build something here, something lasting." The word "we" resonated with Nate, carrying echoes of Mitchell's advice and the silver ring still hidden in his pocket. What kind of family were they building? What did he want it to become? "Mitchell has lived here 20 years, he observed, taken an Apache wife, raised children who belong to both worlds, yet neither fully." Ayana nodded. "It is a difficult path, but not impossible." She studied him in the firelight, her expression thoughtful. "Is that what you're considering? Taking an Apache wife?" The directness of the question caught Nate off guard, though he should have been accustomed to Ayana's straightforward approach by now. "I haven't allowed myself to think that far ahead," he admitted. "But you have feelings," she pressed. Not accusatory, but matter of fact. "For one of us." Nate took a deep breath, realizing the time for evasion had passed. "For you," he said simply, "though I've tried not to." Ayana's expression softened slightly, though she maintained her characteristic reserve. "Because I am Apache, or because of Elizabeth?" "Both, neither." Nate struggled to articulate the complex tangle of emotions he'd been avoiding. "Because I didn't want to presume. Because what we built at Whispering Creek was already so precious, I feared changing it. Because—" He hesitated, then finished honestly, "because I wasn't sure you could ever see me as more than the man who paid for your freedom." Ayana was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. When she finally spoke, her voice held a gentleness he rarely heard from her. "When my husband died, I believed that part of my life was over, that I would never again feel what we call, in our language, walking together, the joining of two paths into one." She looked up from the fire, meeting his eyes directly. "I did not expect to find that possibility with a white man who bought me for $6. Despite the seriousness of the conversation, Nate found himself smiling at the absurdity of their beginning. Life takes unexpected turns. "Yes," Ayana agreed, a rare smile touching her lips as well. "It does." She reached out, an unusual gesture for someone who seldom initiated physical contact, and placed her hand over his. "I do not know what our future holds, Nathaniel Sullivan, but I am willing to walk this path and discover it. Together." The simple touch, the simpler declaration, meant more than any elaborate profession of love. It was Ayana's way, direct, honest, unadorned, and all the more powerful for its restraint. Nate turned his hand beneath hers, intertwining their fingers. "Together," he echoed. The following morning, as mist still clung to the valley floor, Dolly approached Nate with her bow in hand. You should learn to hunt properly, she said without preamble. The rifle makes too much noise. For the next 2 hours, she taught him the basics of Apache archery, how to hold the bow, how to move silently through underbrush, how to anticipate an animal's path. Nate was a quick study, his surgeon's hands adapting easily to the new skill, though his first attempts sent arrows flying wide of their targets. "You are too stiff," Dolly observed, adjusting his stance with a firm hand on his shoulder. "Like you are still at war with yourself." The observation struck deeper than she likely intended. "Maybe I am," Nate admitted, lowering the bow. "Sometimes I wonder if I've made the right choices for Hannah, for all of us." Dolly was silent for a moment, studying him with her characteristic intensity. Then, unexpectedly, she touched her wrist tattoo and held her marked skin toward him. "When Kia died, I thought my path ended. I would follow his spirit soon, I believed." Her voice was low, meant only for him. "But the path continues even when we cannot see it. Your daughter needs more than one guide on her journey, as do you." "And you? What do you need, Dolly?" She considered the question with surprising openness. "To belong again. To protect those who matter." Her eyes met his directly. "You gave us freedom, Nathaniel Sullivan. I choose to give you loyalty. Not because I owe it, but because you have earned it." The declaration, so characteristically straightforward from the reserved Dolly, touched Nate deeply. This wasn't romance, but something equally profound. A warrior's oath, freely given. "Thank you," he said simply. She nodded once, then handed him the bow again. "Now try once more. This time breathe with the forest." Later that afternoon, Nate found Enola and Hannah by the stream, gathering plants for both medicine and food. Hannah was excitedly pointing out different leaves and roots she had learned to identify, her knowledge already impressive after just days of Enola's teaching. "Papa, Enola says this one stops bleeding," Hannah called, holding up a small plant with fuzzy leaves. "Like the medicine you used to make." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Nate replied, genuinely impressed. He turned to Enola. "You're a good teacher." Enola's normally solemn face brightened slightly. "She learns quickly. Like my—" She stopped, the familiar shadow of grief crossing her features. "Like your son would have," Nate finished gently. Enola nodded, her fingers automatically reaching for the small pouch she wore at her waist. A memory bundle, she had once explained, containing a lock of her child's hair. "I cannot replace him," she said softly, watching Hannah wait at the stream's edge. "Just as I cannot replace her mother." Her dark eyes lifted to meet Nate's. "But perhaps I can be something new for her, and she for me." "What would you like to be for her?" Nate asked. "In our way, children may have many mothers, sisters of the birth mother, close friends, elders of the band. All help guide, all help teach." Enola's voice grew more confident as she spoke. "I would like to be one of Hannah's mothers, if you would permit it." The request, so simply stated yet so profound, made Nate's throat tighten with emotion. "I think Elizabeth would like that very much," he said, "and so would Hannah, and so would I." A rare smile transformed Enola's face, making her look younger, unburdened. "Then it is decided." Hannah came running up then, her small hands full of stream-polished stones. "Look what I found. Enola says we can use these to mark our new garden beds." "Our garden?" Nate asked. "Yes," Hannah said matter-of-factly. "Enola says I'm to be her helper since I'm to be her daughter now." Nate glanced at Enola, who watched with quiet anticipation. "Is that what you want, Hannah? For Enola to be like a mother to you?" Hannah considered the question with a child's directness. "I already decided she is," she declared. "And Ayana and Dolly, too. They're all my family now." Out of the mouths of babes, Nate thought, a weight lifting from his heart. What had taken the adults weeks of careful negotiation, Hannah had resolved in her own mind without hesitation or doubt. "Then it's settled," he said, including both Hannah and Enola in his smile. "We are family." Above them, stars wheeled in ancient patterns across the velvet sky. Around them, the night sounds of their new home, crickets chirping, the gentle murmur of the stream, the soft rustle of pine branches in the slight breeze, created a peaceful backdrop to this moment of connection. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adjustments, the hard work of building a life in this wilderness. But tonight, sitting beside the woman who had journeyed from captive to companion to something more, Nate felt a sense of completion that had eluded him since Elizabeth's death. 6 months later, their clearing beside the stream had transformed. Where temporary brush shelters once stood, a permanent lodge now rose, its foundation built in the white settler style with sturdy logs, but its roof and interior arranged according to Apache traditions. The second structure, smaller but equally solid, housed Dolly and Enola, though the four adults and Hannah moved freely between both spaces as one extended family. Nate stood on the ridge above their settlement, watching smoke curl from the chimney into the crisp autumn air. Mitchell appeared beside him, surveying the changes with approval. "You've done well," the older man said. "Never thought I'd see another family like mine take root here." Nate nodded, his hand unconsciously touching the silver ring that now adorned Ayana's finger. Their union had been celebrated 2 months earlier in a ceremony that blended Apache traditions with elements Nate remembered from his own culture. Not a legal marriage by territorial standards, but one recognized by Kianada's band, and more importantly, by their own hearts. "How's the girl adapting?" Mitchell asked. "Hannah?" Nate smiled. "Sometimes I think she's more Apache than any of us now. Speaks the language better than I do." Below, they could see Hannah running with the other children, her laughter carrying up the hillside. She wore a dress Enola had made, decorated with beadwork that told the story of their journey north. "And the others?" "Dolly's become our best hunter," Nate said. "She's teaching me tracking skills I never imagined. Says I'm almost competent now." He chuckled. "Enola has established herself as a healer. People from Kianada's band come to her for remedies. She says she's found purpose again after losing her son." Mitchell nodded knowingly. "And they've found their place? Their arrangement with you and Ayana?" Nate understood the delicate question. "We've created our own way of being family. Different from yours, different from how any of us were raised. Dolly and Enola are Hannah's mothers as much as Ayana. They're my family too, though not in the same way Ayana is." He smiled. "We don't have words for what we are to each other. We just are." Mitchell clapped him on the shoulder. "That's all that matters out here. The naming of things is for townspeople and government men." As they descended toward the settlement, Nate spotted Ayana directing the completion of a storage shed for the winter. She looked up, meeting his gaze across the distance, and raised her hand in greeting, a gesture at once casual and intimate. He remembered that first night in Twin Forks when he'd impulsively handed over $6 to a bounty hunter. Never could he have imagined where that simple action would lead. Whispering Creek had been the end of one chapter. This hidden valley, this unexpected family formed of disparate parts yet somehow fitting together, had become the beginning of another. And for $6, that had been a bargain indeed.